There are tears that fall in the presence of others, and there are tears that fall only in solitude. The first kind seeks comfort. The second kind seeks truth. And last night, somewhere in the quiet of a room you could not enter, the person you love wept tears of the second kind. Not because someone had hurt them, not because the day had been difficult, but because something inside them finally broke open. And what poured out was not sadness in its ordinary form. It was recognition. It was the unbearable weight of a truth they had been avoiding for far too long, finally pushing through the surface and refusing to be denied any longer. Carl Jung once wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. He understood, perhaps more clearly than many psychologists of the modern age, that the soul does not transform through comfort alone. It transforms through the moments when illusion collapses and reality becomes impossible to ignore. The tears that fall in solitude are often the most sacred tears a person can shed because they belong to no one else. They are not performed, they are not explained, they are not softened by an audience. They are the raw expression of a psyche meeting itself, sometimes for the very first time. And when those tears finally arrive, something irreversible has happened within the person who shed them. What I want you to understand as you sit with these words is that the tears of the person you love were not tears of weakness. They were the tears of someone who has finally stopped running. For a long time, this person has been carrying something they did not know how to name. They have been holding feelings they did not know how to express. They have been telling themselves stories that did not quite fit. They have been wearing emotional armor that no longer protected them and avoiding a recognition that has been quietly growing inside them since the moment your paths first crossed. Last night, that recognition reached a depth they could no longer push away, and in the privacy of their own solitude, they allowed themselves, perhaps for the first time, to feel the full weight of what they had been hiding from. Jung described a process he called the shadow encounter. It is the moment when a person finally turns to face the parts of themselves they have spent years avoiding. These parts are not always dark in the way we usually imagine. Sometimes the shadow holds our deepest tenderness, our most genuine longings, and our most vulnerable truths. We push these things into the shadow, not because they are bad, but because they are too powerful to hold without changing us. We fear that if we let them out, we will become someone we no longer recognize. We fear that if we admit what we truly feel, we will have to act on it. We fear that the structure of our lives, carefully built over years, will not survive the honesty of our own hearts. And so we keep these truths hidden even from ourselves until the day arrives when hiding is no longer possible. For the person you love, that day may have now come. Something within them shifted last night. Maybe it was a memory that arrived unexpectedly. Maybe it was a song that played at exactly the right moment. Maybe it was a thought of you that arrived with a clarity they had not allowed themselves to feel before. Maybe it was nothing they could name, just a sudden collapse of the wall they had been holding up for so long that they had forgotten how much effort it required. Whatever the trigger was, the result was the same. They saw themselves clearly. They saw the connection clearly. They saw the truth clearly. And once a person sees these things with real clarity, that seeing cannot simply be reversed. The tears that followed were not only about you, they were about everything. They were about the years spent denying what was already known. They were about the conversations that should have happened but never did. They were about the moments when courage was needed and fear won instead. They were about the version of themselves they had been pretending to be and the version of themselves they were now being asked to become. When a person finally understands a truth they have been avoiding, they grieve not only the situation, but also the time lost to avoidance. This sorrow is not separate from the awakening. It is woven into it. It is part of what consciousness asks of us. Jung understood that a person cannot move toward wholeness without grieving the years, choices, and parts of life lived without full awareness. And this is what you need to understand most clearly. The person you love is not coming undone. They are beginning to come together. The tears that came last night were not evidence of destruction. They were signs of integration. When the psyche finally releases emotions and truths that have been buried for a long time, the process can look like a collapse. From the outside, it may appear as though everything is falling apart. Yet internally, something very different may be taking place. The mind and soul are reorganizing themselves. Old emotional patterns are losing their hold, so new ways of living can emerge. Defenses that once felt necessary are beginning to weaken, making space for greater openness. Stories that once defined the person are reaching their end, allowing a more honest story to begin. Those tears were not the sound of a person breaking. They were the opening of a person who had been closed for too long. And sometimes what opens in the silence of one night is powerful enough to redirect an entire life. Jung recognized that suffering has a place in the journey toward becoming whole. He never suggested that pain should be celebrated for its own sake, but he understood that pain can accomplish what comfort often cannot. Pain exposes what pretense has hidden. It removes layers of self-deception that allow us to remain unchanged. It eventually brings us face to face with what is real within ourselves and within the bonds we share with others. Last night, the person you love may have lost the ability to maintain a pretense they had carried for far too long. The belief that their feelings were not as deep as they truly were. Perhaps they had convinced themselves that they had already moved beyond you, or that they had never been deeply affected in the first place. Maybe they tried to explain the connection away through logic, distance, time, or distraction. But whatever story they used to protect themselves did not survive that night. Without that story, they now stand much closer to their own truth. And you may wonder what exactly they finally came to understand. But this kind of realization rarely arrives as one simple statement. It comes as a gathering of recognitions, each one strengthening the next, until they can no longer be separated. They may have understood that what they feel for you is not something temporary that will simply disappear with enough time. They may have recognized that the bond between you was not invented or exaggerated by their imagination. They may have seen that the silence or distance they created was never a true resolution, but a form of protection. Perhaps they finally understood that certain parts of them come alive in connection with you in ways they have been unable to reproduce elsewhere. And beneath all of this may have been an even more difficult realization. Pretending otherwise had become a quiet way of abandoning themselves. And every act of self-abandonment eventually demands a price. These truths did not arrive as calm thoughts that could be debated or dismissed. They arrived as feeling, as a sudden wave of recognition so powerful that argument became impossible. What makes the moment even more meaningful is that it unfolded in solitude. Jung believed that some of our deepest encounters with the self happen when we are alone, beyond the distractions and expectations of other people. In solitude, there is no audience to impress and no image to maintain. We cannot easily hand our emotions to someone else or hide behind another person's noise. The psyche is left with nowhere to escape, and the self is finally required to hear its own voice. Whether consciously or not, the person you love allowed themselves to meet the truth in that private space. They did not immediately run to someone for reassurance. They did not drown the feeling in distraction or reach for something easier to numb it. Instead, they remained with it. They let the emotion move through them. They allowed themselves to feel what they had spent so long resisting. In doing so, they entered one of the purest forms of self-honesty a human being can experience. That is why last night was more than an emotional release. It was a point of transition. Jung believed that what remains unconscious continually seeks expression, and that the personality itself moves toward becoming more complete. The person you love may now be entering the beginning of that inner transformation. What had been quietly pressing beneath their awareness has finally found a way to surface, and once something hidden has been genuinely acknowledged, it cannot simply be placed back where it was and forgotten. The psyche does not easily erase what it has revealed. Instead, it begins to build upon that awareness, allowing the realization to shape whatever comes next. You may naturally ask what they will do now. Will they contact you? Will they finally speak openly? Will the distance between you begin to close? Those questions are understandable, but they are not necessarily the deepest ones. The more important question is who they are becoming, because our actions eventually grow from the person we are becoming within. Outer transformation follows inner transformation. The person who woke up this morning may not be psychologically identical to the person who began yesterday. Something subtle but profound has shifted in the structure of their inner world, and sooner or later, inner change seeks expression in the outer world. The form it takes and the time it requires may not unfold exactly as you expect. It may move more slowly than you hope. It may appear differently than you imagine. Yet something essential has already been established. The foundation has changed, and foundations influence everything built upon them. There is also a quiet form of courage in what the person you love has just done, even if no one else ever witnessed it. It is the courage to remain with a feeling rather than escape from it. The courage to stay present when the truth is uncomfortable instead of disappearing into distraction. The courage to allow tears to fall rather than forcing them back behind another emotional wall. Jung saw this kind of inner honesty as essential to meaningful transformation. A person who can sit alone with what is true has crossed a threshold that many spend their entire lives trying to avoid. And perhaps this is why you should not look at those tears and think only of sadness. Look deeper. Sometimes tears are the language of a truth that words cannot yet carry. Sometimes a person cries because they have finally realized what they have lost. Sometimes they cry because they understand what they have been afraid to admit. Sometimes they cry because they recognize that the life they were trying to protect was built around a story that no longer feels true. And sometimes they cry because after years of emotional resistance, they finally understand the depth of what another person means to them. The important thing is that the tears do not automatically tell you what their next action will be. They do not guarantee that they will call you. They do not guarantee that they will appear at your door. They do not guarantee that everything between you will suddenly become simple. But they can symbolize an inner moment when denial becomes harder to maintain. And when denial begins to lose its power, something new becomes possible. The person may begin to ask questions they avoided before. Why did I pull away? Why did I become afraid? Why did I pretend I did not care? Why did I keep thinking about this person even after I told myself I had moved on? Why did the connection continue to affect me? Why did I feel so much and say so little? These questions can become uncomfortable because they require a person to look honestly at their own choices. But that is also where growth begins. Growth does not always feel peaceful at first. Sometimes growth feels like confusion. Sometimes it feels like grief. Sometimes it feels like suddenly seeing the past in a completely different light. Sometimes it feels like realizing that the person you blamed was not the only person who was afraid. And sometimes it feels like recognizing that your own defenses protected you once, but now they are preventing you from living honestly. This may be what happened last night. A defense that once protected them may have finally become too heavy to carry. The emotional wall may have served a purpose when the connection first became frightening. It may have helped them maintain control. It may have allowed them to continue with daily responsibilities without confronting feelings they did not understand. But a wall that protects you from pain can also protect you from love. It can keep you safe from rejection while also keeping you distant from intimacy. It can prevent disappointment while also preventing connection. It can help you avoid vulnerability while quietly creating loneliness. Eventually, a person may reach a point where the cost of the wall becomes greater than the risk of lowering it. And that moment can bring tears, not because everything is lost, but because everything is finally being seen. The person you love may now be seeing their own behavior differently. They may be remembering moments when you reached out and they pulled away. They may remember words they wanted to say but swallowed. They may remember opportunities they allowed fear to take away. They may remember the warmth of your presence and wonder why they worked so hard to convince themselves that it did not matter. These memories can become painful when viewed through new awareness, because awareness changes the meaning of memory. The same moment that once seemed ordinary can suddenly become deeply significant. The same conversation that once seemed small can suddenly reveal what both people were afraid to say. The same goodbye that once felt final can suddenly look like an act of protection rather than a lack of feeling. This does not mean every past event should be romanticized. It does not mean every painful action should be excused. It means that deeper awareness can give a person a more complete picture. And perhaps that is what the person you love was experiencing in the quiet of that room. They were not simply crying over you. They were crying over the distance between who they had been and who they now realized they wanted to become. They were crying over choices made from fear. They were crying over words left unsaid. They were crying over the emotional truth they had tried to place somewhere outside themselves. And eventually, they were crying because they could no longer pretend that the truth did not exist. This is why the tears may have felt different from ordinary sadness. Ordinary sadness often wants comfort, but awakening can bring a different kind of sorrow. It asks for honesty. It asks a person to stop looking away. It asks them to admit what is true, even when that truth changes everything. And perhaps this is the deeper meaning of what happened last night. Something in them finally became conscious. Something that had existed beneath the surface for a long time finally entered awareness. And once awareness arrives, the old way of living becomes harder to continue. The person may still be afraid, they may still hesitate, they may still need time, they may not immediately know what to do, but they cannot unknow what they now know. That is the quiet power of consciousness. Once the truth has been seen, pretending becomes more difficult. Once the feeling has been fully experienced, suppressing it becomes more exhausting. Once a person has encountered themselves honestly, they begin to notice where their life does and does not match their inner truth. And this can lead to change. Not necessarily dramatic change, not necessarily immediate change, but meaningful change. Maybe they begin communicating differently. Maybe they stop making excuses. Maybe they become more honest with themselves. Maybe they finally admit to someone close to them that they have been struggling. Maybe they begin considering what it would mean to repair something they once abandoned. Maybe they simply become more aware of the choices they make. All of these can be signs of an inner process unfolding, and you do not have to force that process. You do not have to chase them into awareness. You do not have to convince them of what they feel. You do not have to send messages designed to trigger a reaction. If their realization is genuine, it belongs to them. Their inner work must be completed by them. Your task is not to carry their awakening for them. Your task is to remain grounded in your own life, because there is another danger here. When you deeply love someone, it is easy to become emotionally connected to their imagined transformation. You can begin watching every sign, every coincidence, every dream, and every silence as if it contains a secret message. But you must remember that your life cannot be placed on hold while you wait for another person to become ready. Their awakening may be real. Their feelings may be real. Their tears may have been real. But your peace must also be real. Your healing must also matter. Your growth must also continue. You cannot build your emotional future around what another person may eventually do. You can remain open without becoming dependent. You can hope without abandoning reality. You can care without waiting endlessly. And perhaps this is exactly what makes the possibility of a future connection healthier. If they return, you will meet them from a stronger place. Not from desperation, not from fear, not from the belief that their return is necessary for you to be complete. You will meet them as someone who has also grown. Someone who understands that love is not simply about intensity. It is also about honesty, consistency, responsibility, and the willingness to face difficult conversations instead of escaping them. The tears of last night may therefore represent something much deeper than sadness. They may represent the moment when the person finally became tired of living against their own truth. And if that is what happened, then the next part of their journey will require courage. Because realizing something is one thing, living according to that realization is another. A person can cry all night and still return to old habits the next morning. A person can understand the truth and still be afraid to act on it. A person can recognize love and still struggle with vulnerability. This is why you should not measure transformation by emotion alone. Measure it by what happens after the emotion. Does the person become more honest? Does the person become more responsible? Does the person communicate? Does the person stop hiding? Does the person make choices that reflect what they now claim to understand? These are the things that matter. The tears may open the door, but their actions will determine whether they actually walk through it. And perhaps that is what you need to remember most. You do not have to decide the future tonight. You do not have to know whether they will return. You do not have to predict what they will say. You do not have to search the universe for confirmation. You only need to remain present. Let what is real become visible. Let what is false fall away. Let their actions speak, and let your own inner wisdom guide you. Because while this story may appear to be about someone finally realizing how deeply they feel, it is also about you learning what it means to stop chasing certainty. You cannot force someone to awaken. You cannot make someone face their shadow. You cannot make someone become emotionally ready, but you can become ready to meet reality without losing yourself. And perhaps that is the transformation happening on both sides. They are learning to face what they feel. You are learning to trust yourself regardless of what they choose. They are learning to stop running from their inner truth. You are learning to stop running after someone else's answer. They are being asked to become honest with themselves. You are being asked to become honest with yourself.